Welcome back, my dear listeners. This is a new episode of the history of the American Mafia, a podcast written by Fabio Fabiano, translated and read by Grace Catlisi. I hope you enjoy today's episode. We're going to talk about Vito Genovese. He was considered one of the most treacherous, double-dealing, ruthless mafia bosses of the entire American Mafia. Joe Valacchi, the first turncoat of American Mafia, said of him, "If you go to Vito and tell him about someone who's behaving badly, he will have him killed. Then he will have you killed for having told him about the guy." He was the head of the mafia family that bears his name from 1957 until the year of his death in 1969. He was born in Risigliano, province of Naples in Italy, on the 27th of November 1897. In 1913, Vito emigrated to America with his family and settled in Little Italy, New York, where some of his relatives already lived. In 1915, he was arrested for illegal possession of firearms and sentenced to 1 year prison. After leaving prison, he met Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, all members of the Mafia Masseria family. He and Luciano became inseparable, and their friendship lasted for almost 40 years. In 1931, Luciano, together with other bosses, organized the murder of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two most powerful of the mafiosis of the time. Luciano, the new boss of the family, appointed Genovese as his deputy. Thus, at just 34 years of age, Vito becomes one of the most powerful mafia members in New York. In 1936, Luciano was arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. While continuing to rule from prison, he entrusts the family regency to his deputy Genovese. In 1937, he was accused by a New York prosecutor of being the mastermind behind the murder of Ferdinand the Shadow Botcher, a soldier and his former partner in the family. Genovese was forced to flee, leaving the United States and taking refuge in Italy. As the opportunist and bootlicker he was, immediately became a supporter of Benito Mussolini and other fascist hierarchics. In 1943, with the landing of the Allies in Sicily, Genovese became the official interpreter of Colonel Charles Poletti. Genovese prospers with his black market and smuggling businesses, thanks to corrupt American officials, including Poletti himself, linked to the mafia. But in 1945, the military police discovered his shady dealings, arrested him, and returned him to the United States to put him on trial. During the course of the trial, key witnesses began to die in mysterious ways, naturally murdered by Genovese's men. The deaths, thanks to corrupt police authorities, are archived as suicides, so Genovese is acquitted of all charges. During Genovese's absence, Frank Costello had taken over the reins of the crime family, previously led by Lucky Luciano. Once Vito Genovese had resolved his problems with the law, considering himself the second-in-command boss of the gang after Lucky Luciano, he wanted the leadership of the mafia family back. Clearly, Frank Costello wasn't happy about this. Rumors initially spread that during his temporary exile in Italy, his men had not been treated well by Costello and had not prospered like the rest of the family. Instead, Costello had treated Vito Genovese and his men with great respect. Genovese was resentful because when he left the USA, he had occupied a more advanced position than Costello and was convinced he would return to his position as a boss. But things didn't quite work out that way. Costello remained the boss of the family, and Genovese ended up relegated to the rank of subordinated boss. In 1951, Genovese began a form of Cold War and has Willie Moretti assassinated. Costello was not to fall for his provocations in order to avoid triggering a fratricidal war within the family. Joe Adonis was expelled from the United States in 1953, and so Frank Costello's power begins to collapse. In 1957, with the death of John DeNoia from natural causes, the withdrawal from mafia activities of John Biello, and the murder of Albert Anastasia, head of the Mangano family and ally of Costello, Genovese decides that the time has come to depose Frank Costello from his throne. On May 2, 1957, Genovese decided to re-establish the old hierarchy by sending Vincent Gigante, his trusted killer, to shoot Costello. Gigante aims at Costello's head as the victim walks towards the elevator in the lobby of his Manhattan apartment. Costello, fortunately, was only grazed, therefore he escaped the murder attempt. After that episode, he decides to retire to private life and hands over the command of his family to Genovese. In 1959, however, Genovese was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison, accused of being one of the organizers of heroin trafficking. Despite being in prison, Genovese continued to give orders to his associates. He appointed Anthony Strollo as regent, who together with Catena, Miranda, Lombardo and Eboli managed the gang's affairs. In 1962, he had Strollo killed because, according to him, he had become too independent and too close to Carlo Gambino. But the boss's troubles with the law didn't end. In 1963, his men Joe Valacchi, imprisoned in the same prison as Genovese, feared being killed on the orders of his elderly boss. Terrified by that prospect, he agreed to testify against him and the entire mafia, thus becoming the first Cosa Nostra turncoat in the USA. All the information provided by this first collaborator of justice caused a great deal of damage to Genovese's image, since the other bosses considered him responsible for Joe Valacchi's repentance. Vito Genovese died in prison of a heart attack in 1969 at the age of 72.